The story begins in a town where dust never settled, where money and whiskey spoke louder than scripture, and where men measured themselves not by the weight of their character, but by the size of their land and the sharpness of their reputation. Among them lived a rancher whose wealth stretched far beyond the fences of his sprawling property. He was not just rich in cattle or acres, he was rich in arrogance. His boots shone cleaner than most men's Sunday coats, and his words carried the tone of a man who had never been told no for long. That night, under the glow of gas lamps and the haze of cheap tobacco smoke, the saloon was alive with the usual racket of cards slapping on wooden tables and dice tumbling across counters sticky with spilled beer. The rancher sat at the center of it all, surrounded by men who called themselves his friends, though none of them would dare stand by him when bullets started flying. They laughed at his jokes a little too quickly, nodded at his boasts a little too eagerly, and waited for any chance to ride the wave of his wealth. The rancher liked to feed off this attention. He puffed his chest, tossed coins at the barkeep without counting, and told tales of his own glory, some true, many exaggerated. But what he loved most were the bets. Bets gave him a sense of conquest, of danger tamed by his own hand. From horses to cards to the lives of lesser men he wagered recklessly, because he had never truly lost. It was sometime past midnight, when whiskey blurred judgment and pride swelled louder than reason, that the bet was made. One of the men, leaning too close with liquor on his breath, whispered of the widow. Everyone in town knew of her, though few claimed to know her well. She lived on the edge of the prairie, in a house that had grown weathered and gray like a scar that never healed. They said she was beautiful still, though her beauty carried the weight of sorrow and secrets. Her husband had died years ago, but the story of his death was a tangled thing, told in whispers that died quickly when the widow's name passed men's lips. The rancher smirked when her name was brought up. He leaned back in his chair, boots crossed at the ankle, and laughed with the kind of confidence that came from never facing consequences. "You think she's untouchable?" he asked, a sneer curling his lips. The men nodded, half afraid, half entertained. The widow was a mystery wrapped in silence, and her rejection was said to cut deeper than any blade. That was all the invitation the rancher needed. His pride was a beast easily provoked, and with the whole saloon watching, he could not resist. He raised his glass high and declared that he could have her, win her, and share her bed before the week was out. The men jeered and clapped, some in disbelief, others in cruel amusement. Coins clattered onto the table. Whiskey flowed faster. A bet was sealed, not with contracts or signatures, but with the intoxicated promises of drunken men. And though it was made in laughter, there was a darkness to it. Because beneath the surface, everyone felt the widow was not a prize but a warning. The rancher did not care. To him, women were ornaments, land was a tool, and people were pawns in his games. He left the saloon that night with his head high, his pride inflated, and his fate sealed. The ride to the widow's house was long, and the night air had sobered him only slightly. The prairie stretched endlessly under a cold moon, and the sound of his horse's hooves echoed like a drumbeat marking time. He felt the thrill of the chase, the arrogance of a man who believed the world owed him everything he demanded of it. But there was something else, too, a silence so heavy it pressed against his ears, a quiet that seemed to warn him he was not riding toward conquest, but toward something far more final. The widow's house appeared on the horizon like a shadow carved out of the earth itself. No lanterns lit the windows, no smoke rose from the chimney. It stood silent, untouched by laughter or warmth, like a tombstone planted in the soil. As he drew closer, the horse slowed on its own, ears twitching uneasily. The rancher cursed and spurred the animal forward, unwilling to admit to himself that even beasts could sense what men refused to see. When he reached the porch, he dismounted and stood still for a long moment. The wood creaked under his boots as though it had not felt the weight of visitors in many years. He lifted his hand to knock but hesitated, listening to the sound of his own heartbeat. Finally, he rapped on the door. Once, twice, 3 times. The door opened with a slow groan, and there she was, the widow. Her face was pale in the moonlight, her hair long and dark, her eyes sharp enough to cut him down where he stood. She said nothing at first, only looked at him as though she had been expecting this very moment, as though his arrival was not a surprise, but an inevitability. For the first time that night, the rancher's arrogance faltered, if only slightly. He cleared his throat, adjusted his hat, and smiled with the charm he had used to win over so many others. But the widow's silence weighed heavier than any rejection he had ever known. It was not the silence of indifference nor of shyness. It was the silence of judgment, of knowing more than she let on. Still, she did not close the door, and that, to the rancher, was victory enough. As he stepped across the threshold, the cold night air clinging to his shoulders, he did not realize that this was no bet, no game, no fleeting conquest.
It was the beginning of
something else entirely, something that would strip him bare of all his power and leave him trembling. Before truths he had spent his whole life ignoring, and, though he could not yet see it, the bet that should never have been made had already sealed his doom. The door closed behind him with a sound that seemed louder than it should have been. The rancher stood in the entryway of the widow's house, adjusting his coat as though to shake off the weight of the night air, but what pressed on his shoulders was not the cold. It was the strangeness of the place. The house smelled of wood smoke long extinguished, of dust and something faintly metallic like old iron left to rust. The air felt heavy, as if the walls had absorbed years of grief and kept it there, sealed tight. The widow said nothing. She moved ahead of him with a quiet grace, her steps soundless on the wooden floorboards, and gestured for him to follow. He did, though he found himself looking over his shoulder more than once, certain that eyes watched him from the shadows. The lamps were dim, leaving corners swallowed in darkness, and every object seemed arranged with deliberate care, as though the house itself were a memory rather than a home. On the mantel above the cold fireplace rested an old rifle. It was polished, well cared for, though clearly of a make from years past. Beside it stood a framed photograph, its glass clouded, but the image within still sharp enough to see. A man in uniform, stiff posture, steady eyes. The widow's husband, no doubt. The rancher glanced at it, then quickly looked away. She finally spoke. Her voice was low, steady, neither warm nor hostile. "You've come a long way," she said, but it was not a question. He smiled, tipping his hat, trying to summon his usual charm. "Distance is no trouble for me." Her gaze lingered on him for a moment longer before she turned and walked toward the sitting room. He followed, though he felt as though he were being led. Not welcomed. They sat opposite one another. The widow with her hands folded in her lap, the rancher leaning back with forced ease, one boot crossed over the other. He studied her in the dim light, and the longer he looked, the less confident he became. Her beauty was undeniable, but it was not the kind he was used to conquering. It was sharpened by sorrow, hardened by years of solitude, wrapped in something he could not name. He filled the silence with words. That was his habit, after all, to charm, to talk, to overwhelm. He spoke of his land, his cattle, his victories in cards and horse races. He sprinkled his sentences with little compliments, meant to flatter her, meant to win her over as he had done with so many others. But the widow did not smile. She listened, yes, but her eyes gave nothing away. At times, she tilted her head slightly, as if weighing his words, measuring them against something he could not see. The silence stretched long between his sentences, and he found himself speaking faster, eager to fill the space that seemed to swallow him whole. On the table beside her rested a small oil lamp, its flame trembling. In its light, he noticed the details of the room, the worn rug beneath their feet, the shelves lined with books whose spines had faded, the faint mark of a bullet hole in the wall near the window. He blinked at that, but when he looked again, her gaze was fixed on him, and he dared not ask. The night dragged on. Whiskey was poured, though she drank sparingly, while he let the liquor dull the edge of his unease. He told himself he was winning. After all, she had not turned him away. She had not scolded him, had not slammed the door in his face. She led him into her house, sat with him, listened to him. In his arrogance, he took that for a victory. But beneath his pride, something gnawed at him, a growing awareness that he was not in control here. The widow had not resisted him, true, but neither had she yielded. It was as if she were allowing him to walk further into a snare he could not yet see. Eventually she rose, her movements slow, deliberate. Without a word, she walked down the narrow hallway, the hem of her dark dress brushing the floor. She did not look back, but the rancher, drunk on pride and liquor, followed her as though drawn by an invisible tether. The hallway was lined with closed doors, each one seeming to hum with silence, each one holding secrets he could feel pressing against the walls. At the end, she opened a door and stepped into the room beyond. It was her bedroom. The rancher paused at the threshold, surprised. For all his boasting, he had not truly believed she would allow this. Yet here he was, standing at the edge of the very thing he had wagered. She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, they simply stood there, her with her eyes dark and steady, him with his heart pounding harder than he cared to admit. Then she stepped aside, giving him space to enter. He crossed the threshold, and the door closed behind them. The rest of the night unfolded in shadows and silence. The rancher, convinced at last of his triumph, surrendered to the haze of whiskey and desire. He did not notice the way she watched him, did not hear the way her breaths carried no warmth, did not feel the weight of the unseen eyes that seemed to linger in every corner of the room. By the time he closed his eyes, he believed he had won. He believed the bet was his to boast of come morning. He believed the widow had been conquered, like land, like cattle, like every other thing he had ever taken for himself. But the truth was something far darker. Because while he dreamed of victory, the widow lay awake beside him. Her eyes open, her thoughts sharp as blades. She had not resisted because there had been no need. She had not pushed him away because this was what she had waited for. And as the night deepened, the silence of the house grew heavier, pressing in on every beam and board, wrapping itself around the sleeping rancher like a shroud. The widow's silence was not surrender. It was the sound of judgment waiting to be spoken. The sun rose slow and pale, casting its first light across the empty plains before it ever touched the widow's house. Inside, shadows still clung to the corners, and the air was heavy, as though the darkness of night had refused to leave entirely. The rancher stirred awake with the sluggishness of a man who had drunk more than he should. His mouth dry, his head pounding faintly. For a moment he did not know where he was. The ceiling above him was low, the wood old and cracked. This was no polished room in his grand ranch house. It was smaller, older, filled with a silence that pressed close around him. Then he turned his head and saw her. The widow sat in a chair near the window, her back straight, her hands resting lightly in her lap. She was fully dressed, as though she had not slept at all. Her face was calm, her eyes fixed on him, not with affection, nor with curiosity, but with a kind of watchfulness that made his skin prickle. For the first time in many years, the rancher felt small. He tried to laugh it off. He stretched, rubbed his face, and spoke in that easy drawl he used to charm and disarm. "Well now," he said, his voice rough from drink, "I reckon that makes me the luckiest man in town." But his words fell flat in the heavy air. The widow did not smile. She did not speak. She simply watched him, her silence sharper than any retort. The rancher cleared his throat, sat up, and swung his legs over the side of the bed. His boots sat neatly by the wall, polished as if untouched. His coat hung from the chair where he had draped it the night before. Everything was in its place, yet nothing felt right. Finally the widow spoke. Her voice was soft, but each word carried a weight that silenced the room. "Do you know how my husband died?" The rancher blinked at her, caught off guard. He forced a chuckle. "Sure, I heard tell of it. Hunting accident, wasn't it? Got himself in the wrong place at the wrong time." The widow's gaze did not waver. "Accidents don't leave that many bullet holes." The rancher's smile faltered. His throat went dry, and for a moment he could not think of what to say. He laughed again, but it was nervous now, thinner, brittle. "People talk. You know how it is in towns like this. Stories grow taller than fence posts." But the widow leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving his. "Stories don't bleed out on my kitchen floor." A chill ran through him. He tried to shake it off, rising to his feet, pulling on his coat as if preparing to leave. But his movements were clumsy, betraying the unease that gnawed at his gut. The widow rose too, slowly, gracefully. She crossed the room with deliberate steps, each one sounding louder than it should have in the stillness of the house. When she reached the fireplace, she lifted the old rifle from the mantel. Her hands moved with familiarity, with ease. The rancher froze. She did not aim it at him. Not yet. She simply held it, resting the weight of it in her arms like one might cradle a memory. "Men like you think the past stays buried," she said, her voice steady, almost quiet. "But the earth has a way of spitting up bones when the time is right." The rancher tried to protest, to reassert his control. "Now listen, I don't know what you're—" But she cut him off with a glance, sharp enough to stop him cold. He felt a bead of sweat trail down the back of his neck. His heart thudded harder than he wanted to admit. This was not how it was supposed to be. He had come here to win a bet, to boast, to prove once again that there was nothing in this world he could not take. But now, in the pale light of morning, he was no conqueror. He was a man standing in a stranger's house, with a stranger's eyes on him, and for the first time, he was beginning to wonder if the joke had always been on him. The widow set the rifle back on the mantel with care, her fingers lingering on the worn wood as if it were an old friend. Then she turned back to him, her eyes colder than the steel of any weapon. And though she had not yet spoken the truth aloud, he felt it pressing against him already. That there was something in her silence, something in the way she looked at him, that carried the weight of a revelation he was not ready to hear. The morning light crept higher through the window, but it brought no warmth, only the widow's silence and the dread it carried. The silence between them grew so thick it seemed to press against the walls. The rancher shifted uncomfortably, tugging at his collar, though the air inside the house was cool. His usual confidence, the charm, the bravado, the smug grin had begun to slip. The widow's eyes had stripped it away piece by piece, leaving him bare, leaving him with nothing but the pounding of his own heart. At last, she moved. She walked to a small cabinet near the corner of the room, pulled open a drawer, and returned with something in her hand. It was a folded letter, yellowed with age, its edges worn, the ink faded but still legible. She held it out, and though he hesitated, the rancher took it. His eyes scanned the words, his lips moving silently as he read. The handwriting was firm, the tone urgent. It was a message from a man pleading for his life, for his family, for the land he had built with his own 2 hands. The rancher's breath caught in his throat. He knew this letter, or rather, he knew the kind of deal it described. Years ago, he had sat across a table in another saloon, drunk on power as much as whiskey. A man had offered him land at a price too low to resist, but the man who owned that land refused to sell, obstinate, proud, clinging to what little was his. And so the rancher had made an arrangement. He paid men, ruthless, nameless drifters, to convince the stubborn landowner to reconsider. He hadn't asked for details. He never wanted them. He simply wanted results. And when the land came into his possession, he celebrated his victory as he always did, never sparing a thought for the blood spilled to secure it. Now, staring at the letter in his trembling hands, the truth settled on him like the noose tightening around a condemned man's neck. The widow's voice cut through the silence. "You paid them!" The rancher looked up, his face pale, his throat too dry to answer. "You paid men to kill him," she continued, her words calm, deliberate, like a judge reading a sentence. "My husband. He didn't die in an accident. He didn't fall to some twist of fate. He died because you wanted more than what was yours." The rancher shook his head violently, though the letter trembled in his grip. "No, I didn't know." Her eyes burned into him, steady, merciless. "You knew enough. You knew you'd never see his face. You knew you'd never hear the shots. You knew you'd never have to dig the grave. That's why you paid them, so your hands would stay clean while his blood soaked into my floorboards." He staggered back, dropping the letter as though it had burned him. His mind raced, scrambling for excuses, for lies, for anything that might absolve him. But nothing came. Every word he might have spoken turned to ash in his mouth. The widow did not move. She stood rooted, unshaken, a figure carved of grief and steel. "I knew from the start," she said. "When you knocked on my door, when you smiled that smug smile, when you thought this was just another conquest to boast of. I knew who you were, and I let you in." The rancher felt the room closing in around him. His chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths. For the first time in his life, he felt what it was to be hunted. He tried to muster defiance. "If you knew," he said, his voice cracking despite his effort, "then why let me stay?" Why let this happen?" The widow stepped closer. Her presence seemed to fill the room, her shadow long in the morning light. "Because men like you don't die from accidents either. You die when the truth finally finds you, and I wanted you to feel it, every last drop of it. The weight of what you did, the knowledge that the woman you came here to claim was the same woman who waited for this moment." Her words sliced through him, leaving him hollow. His hands shook. He reached for his coat as though to leave, to escape, but his legs felt weak, his body heavy. He stumbled, catching himself on the edge of the table. That was when he realized his mistake. The whiskey. The night before, she had poured it for him, her hand steady, her glass untouched. He had drunk deeply, laughing, boasting, never questioning. And now a slow, burning sickness coursed through his veins, twisting his stomach, weakening his limbs. His eyes widened. He looked at her in horror. The widow's expression did not change. She merely stood, calm and resolute, as if watching justice take shape. "Your bet was never about me," she said. "It was about you, about how much you could take before your sins caught up with you. And now they have." The rancher's legs gave out, and he fell hard to his knees, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His hands clawed at the floorboards, at anything that might keep him anchored to a world that was already slipping from his grasp. The widow bent down and picked up the letter he had dropped. She folded it carefully, set it back on the mantel beside the rifle, and turned her gaze down on him. For the first time, she smiled. But it was not a smile of warmth, nor of triumph. It was a smile carved from grief, hardened by years of waiting. "You've lost your bet," she whispered. And in that moment, the rancher understood that the true wager had never been whether he could bed the widow. It was whether he could escape the truth of what he had done, and he had lost. The night air was colder than expected for late summer in the Wild West. A heavy stillness hung over the ranch's sprawling property, a silence broken only by the occasional restless stomp of a horse in the stables and the whisper of dry grass bending in the wind. Inside his grand house, the rich rancher, once the most envied man in town, sat alone at his polished oak table. The whiskey in his glass trembled against the flicker of the oil lamp, and though the liquor was strong, it could not warm him. What the widow had revealed days earlier haunted him still. At first, he had tried to dismiss it as a clever lie meant to rattle him, but every look in her eyes, every quiver in her voice, replayed with chilling truth. She had spoken not as a scorned woman, but as someone who had walked through fire and carried ash in her lungs. She had told him of the night her husband was killed, how it wasn't just an accident, nor a misfortune but a deliberate act. She spoke of deals struck in shadow, of men paid to corner her husband at the edge of town, and she named him, the rancher himself. At the time of her revelation, he had frozen, unable to form words. Now, sitting in the suffocating quiet of his own house, he couldn't escape it. He remembered that night clearly, though he had buried it deep. He remembered the cold bargaining, the thrill of removing competition, the arrogance of thinking it would never come back to him. But she had found out, through whispers, through scraps of letters, through the dying words of one of the hired men. And now she held all the power. The next day, she came to him again. Not as a lover, not as the widow who had once entertained his arrogance. She came cloaked in black, the morning sun burning against the veil that shaded her face. Her presence seemed to draw every eye in town, for they all knew the rancher had been seen too often with her of late. Inside the saloon, where men gambled and dust hung thick in the air, she walked straight to him. The room fell into hush. The rancher tried to maintain his composure, but the silence felt like a noose tightening around his throat. She placed a folded piece of paper on the table in front of him. No words, no threats, just a gesture. He opened it and his blood ran cold. It was not just her accusation. It was evidence. Documents, signed in his own hand, contracts that linked his fortune to the very men who had ambushed her husband. A dead man's papers, saved and hidden all these years, now carried by the one person who had reason to use them. "Your wealth built this town," she said quietly, but her voice carried sharp as glass. "But so did blood. And every man here will know it." The rancher rose, trying to laugh it off, trying to charm the crowd as he had done so many times before. But the men didn't laugh. They stared. Some narrowed their eyes. Others shifted uneasily, as if the truth had long been suspected. Then she turned to leave. No threats, no bargains, just the quiet assurance that she had stripped him bare before the eyes of his people. That night, the rancher stood again at his table, staring into his glass. But the whiskey no longer burned. It tasted of dirt, of graves, of the blood money that had propped up his empire. Outside, men whispered. Horses stirred restlessly. His empire of wealth had become a fragile shell, and every creak of wood in his house felt like the approach of judgment. The bet had been his arrogance. The secret had been her weapon, and now she held the victory, not in gold, not in land, but in the ruin of a man who thought himself untouchable. And as dawn broke over the dusty horizon, the rancher knew there was no whiskey strong enough, no land wide enough, no fortune vast enough to silence what the widow had revealed. He was undone.